You are the salt of the earth, but if salt loses its effectiveness, what is it good for other than to be thrown out and trampled underfoot? Let us bow together for a moment. In the midst of these days of preoccupation and tension and unknowing, grant us a moment apart where we may hear a word sure and strong, that we may live. In the Spirit of Jesus, Amen. I do not pray you to take them out of the world, but to keep them from evil. They are strangers in the world as I am. We've stood with any number of friends from this congregation a dozen times or so in the room where Jesus prayed this prayer on the night before he died. This rather strange prayer that we might live in the world but not be of the world. What world? Certainly not the world of God's good creation, the world of nature of which we are all a part. We're all of us part of God's good creation. I saw a cartoon recently picturing a husband and wife sitting before the television set, and she's saying, "I hope there's a good nature program on TV tonight. We're losing touch with nature." No, he's not talking about the world of nature. He's talking about the world of culture, not the world of God's creation, but the world of our creation. And by culture, I mean here not Goethe or Gauguin or Mozart or Gucci or the Grand Tour. I mean all those habits and traditions and attitudes and prejudices and patterns and practices that make up human life in our world. The American culture, if you will, the American way of life, we call it. In Jesus' day, the world was Roman power and privilege and pagan rituals, heavy on sex and light on morality, and Jewish performance of the law and Greek philosophy and leisurely ways. It was a variety of cultures bidding for attention and applause. In many ways, I guess, a scene not unlike ours in our own land. How would you characterize the habits and lifestyles in latter-day America? We're justly proud of our institutions, our freedom, our order. We're prepared to defend them. But what of the culture out there? It certainly is messy and confusing in many ways. We live in a consumer society, for example. Consumption is the engine that drives our growth and affluence, has pulled many people out of poverty, and we worry at the moment that people will stop buying. But what about consumerism, the growing tendency on the part of so many to focus life simply on accumulation of things? So many prowl our malls for more than products essential, I think. They buy and buy and buy, seemingly as if somewhere along the line they will buy some fulfillment. The bumper sticker says, "I shop, therefore I am." Every day, the mail at our house brings an incredible pile of catalogs advertising an unbelievable array of things, not one of which I need. Has not consumption, though, become a rather dominating interest for many? Or if not consumption, then ambition. The drive to succeed is a central motif of American culture, and again, it has been part of the dynamism of our society. This concern to achieve recognition and status. A business executive tells an interviewer, "I started at the bottom, I worked 14 hours a day, I sweated, I fought, I maneuvered, I took abuse, but I kept on climbing the ladder." To which the interviewer asked, "And now you feel that you are happy?" "No, I wouldn't say that," said the executive. "Just quote me as saying that I've become an expert at climbing ladders." But to fail by the standards of the day is the worst humiliation for a lot of people, especially young people. Or again, do we not appear to be a folk bent on the quest for pleasure, diversion, amusement, fun, entertainment? We do not watch 27 hours a week of television just for the information. The preoccupation with sports is almost epidemic. I received an ad for Direct Television recently with the promise that if I purchased the dish, I could watch 10 football games on any given weekend. Awful thought. One could go on. But then the world has never been, except for rare and special moments, anything other than a mixture of religious and secular, good and bad. So the question is really that Jesus is posing is, how do we live in that kind of world without losing our souls? How can we undergo its pressures and participate in its pleasures without letting these dictate who we really are fundamentally? How can we live in such a way that we're not swallowed up, become mere reflections of this kind of culture, retain some power to shape our own lives and influence the direction of community and nation? I think the answer lies with an older story than our country's, the story of the community of faith, of which we all are part. And it's a remarkable story in many ways, hidden and invisible, but worldwide today. When Jesus spoke these words to his inner circle 2,000 years ago, his followers numbered in the low hundreds, if that. 10 years after his death, the estimate is perhaps 1,000. Between the years 50 and 100 of this era, the growth of the Jesus movement took off. By the year 100, they numbered around 7,000, but by 250 AD, they were well into the millions, followers of this man out of Nazareth. By 350 AD, half the world's population had embraced his name. The story in recent times has been even more phenomenal. From 6 million Christians in 1900 to 2 billion in the year 2000, or a third of the Earth's population. And unexpectedly, most of this growth has come in third world countries. Now there are more Christians in the southern hemisphere than there are in the northern, than in the traditional centers of Europe and North America. Even more surprising is the incredible diversity of this faith. There are 34,000 identifiable Christian groups in the world today. Consider these astounding realities. Last Sunday, it is probable that more believers attended church in China than in all of so-called Christian Europe. Last Sunday, more Episcopalians attended church in each of Kenya, South Africa, Tanzania, and Uganda than in all of Great Britain and the United States. Last Sunday, there were more Presbyterians at church in Ghana than in Scotland, more Presbyterians at church in South Africa than in the United States. And the largest Christian congregations today are, where would you guess? Seoul, Korea. 15,000, 20,000 to a congregation. Now this is a story that through history has not always been positive and healthy. When the church has been yoked with the state and served to legitimate the political powers, as it was in Europe and still is to some degree, it has sadly been part of a great deal of cruelty and oppression. But where it has maintained its freedom from state authority, as is the case in most of the world today, although there are more Christians being persecuted today than at any time in the last 2,000 years, where it has managed to maintain a significant independence, it has been a ferment for human freedom and individual dignity and care for the sick and education of the young and concern for the poor, where it has been what Jesus called it to be, in the world but not of it, where it has been, to use another metaphor, where it has been salt. Jesus' use of the word to describe our responsibility and role is interesting. Salt is not a central element, if you stop and think about it, in the food supply. You hardly eat nothing but salt. But what does it do? Well, in this day and age, we think of it primarily as flavoring. As the little fellow said, salt is what spoils the mashed potatoes when it's left out. Part of our problem with salt, of course, is too much of it, right? I finished one can of tomato juice the other day, and then I read the label. I had just ingested 65% of my daily requirement of sodium. But in Jesus' day, the role of salt was far more important, far more critical. It was a precious commodity as a preservative. Before refrigeration, salted foods were the lifeline to survival when fresh foods became scarce, which they did a good chunk of the year. It was also used, interestingly, as a disinfectant, salt in the wounds, to promote health. And Jesus may well have seen the role of his new little community in the larger world as a kind of preservative of real life in the midst of so many forces that tended to diminish and destroy. Here's a call, I think, to thoughtful and selective interaction with the options presented by that world around us, rather than simple immersion in it, going along with the fads and fashions of the day. Here is a call for a community of people willing to judge what is appropriate for family and children and career, no matter what others may be doing. Being uncontaminated by the culture means asking hard questions. Functioning as a preserving and healing force means pushing priorities against the pressures of everyday life. There's nothing wrong, for example, with the struggle to succeed. Even Dietrich Bonhoeffer said, success is always better than failure. But do I really want to pay the price in family life that all-out drive for the top may demand of me? Before he died, fighting bravely and feeling deeply, Lee Atwater of another administration said, I acquired more wealth and power and prestige than most, but you can acquire all that you want and still wake up in the morning empty. And it took a deadly illness to put me eye to eye with that truth. Sports can be an important element in the growth and discipline of our children and our enjoyment of life, especially when the Bears are winning. But is it necessary that my children compete in all the sports their friends are involved in? Enjoying the good gifts of life is fine, but do we really need the accumulation of all the latest gadgets and games? Do we really have to go along with our neighbors in their attitudes towards social life? Are we prepared to discipline our days and ways so that we have some quiet, some leisure time together? Have we thought more about time for friendship as the years slip away from us? In other words, am I prepared with my Christian friends to shape my own life rather than let the seductions and pressures of the culture shape me? Do I have the courage to be selective and deliberate about my days? This, I think, is part of what it means to be in but not of the world, taking the time to think and decide as a community of faith. We act as a healing and preserving additive over against the pressures of the larger culture. At least some conscious recognition of what's going on, at least some intentional shaping of our own future. You see, the early Christian community grew like it did, drew people to it because of its refusal to buy into the popular idolatries of that age, because of its moral integrity over against the callousness and corruptions and sloppiness of the Greco-Roman world. Living in but not of the world, but also generating health and life for that world. This is another first century use of salt which is totally lost to us now, but research pretty well indicates that it was used in the kind of land they had in the Middle East as fertilizer. It was scattered on and worked into the soil in order to enhance growth and life. And Jesus may, in that sense, call his followers the salt of the earth. They are not only to be careful about the world out there, they are to be enmeshed in it, making for health and life. Involved in witness to those values and needs that the culture tends to neglect, but which are necessary for a good future. Indeed, the reason the Christian church grew in its first century was not because of charismatic preachers or powerful political allies or hierarchy. It grew because of the quality of the lives of the average believer. Rodney Stark, a professor of sociology at the University of Washington, in a marvelous study entitled The Rise of Christianity, tells why the church grew. Because of the quality of life exhibited by the Christian community, their honesty and integrity, but even more, their willingness to risk themselves in caring not only for their own people, but for the larger community. Their manner of life stood in stark contrast to that of the pagan world. In fact, in the year 362, stay with me, we'll get through this history quickly. In 362, the pagan Emperor Julian tried to re-paganize the Roman Empire. And he complains in a letter we have to a pagan priest of Galatia that the pagans need to get their act together and begin to equal the virtues of Christians. Because recent Christian growth, he writes, was caused by their benevolence, toward strangers. I quote him, the impious Galileans, that's you and me, the impious Galileans support not only their own poor, but ours as well. And everyone can see that our people lack aid from us. So where are the human needs neglected by the society at large in our time? They're all over the place. I think of people who find themselves out of work and not in a very good position to reproduce where they were, very often lonely and without hope. Who cares about them? Stands by them. Our friends grappling with sudden illness that medicine can do little about. The single mothers who find themselves with lowered standards of living and dual roles and the need to support a family. Who cares about them? And the children, above all the children, living in a crazy world of mixed signals and confused parents. Who cares about them? U.S. News reported a research project involving children who somehow had survived incredible handicaps, whether poverty or absentee parents or alcoholic or otherwise dysfunctional families. Why do they survive and thrive? Asked the research. I quote, you locate a resilient kid and you'll find somewhere in his or her life a caring adult or several who have cared. Even in those early days of the movement, there was an abundance of real need out there calling for healing, and there always will be. And it's as we reach out to the true victims of this culture and time that we learn to stay positive and hopeful in the midst of a confusing and often less than constructive climate. I love the poem, who will make the city joyful? Who will wipe away its tears? Who will fill the street with gladness? Who will calm the old folks' fears? Who will tell the children stories? Who will make their clear eyes gleam? Who will keep the men from killing? Who will give the women dreams? Who will make us laugh and love? Maybe mothers loving babies, maybe gentle eyes that see, or beyond the other maybes, maybe you, maybe me. The salt of the earth we're called to be, preserving life, producing life, and confident that God is the Lord of life. Our function, you know, is to make our witness, to do our part as best we can where we are, not to save the world, knowing that lies with the one to whom it belongs. He's got the whole wide world in his hands. Life in a messy and confusing world, when the future seems often so foggy, is possible with hope and joy only as we realize that it is still in the hands of God. I can't help but remember a scene a few years ago in the Church of St. Mary in East Berlin. It was before the wall came down and communism collapsed into the dustbin of history. There, a dear friend of ours spoke of hope and purpose in a land where the culture was far more alien than ours. He spoke of the kingdoms of this world with their arrogance and power, and then he reminded us that there is another kingdom. We cannot see it. Often it seems incredible that it could even be. We cannot see it, he said, but it is present. It is working its way in the human story, and he said there is no doubt which kingdom will win. History tells us which kingdom won there. I hearken back to some favorite words of Harry Emerson Fosdick, who influenced my career as much as any single person, summing up his life around the time of World War II. The words have a strangely contemporary ring, I think. He writes, "As for the world's future, I am not so discouraged as many are. Granted that the old easygoing optimism is impossible. Today, complacency is out. To be sure, a sensible man's life, though, must not be all tension. One does not go about all day exclaiming, 'My God, in what a century you've caused me to live.' There are healthy diversions. There is golf and reading and nature's beauty and human friendship and Beethoven's Concerto in D major. Nevertheless, at 80 years and 18, I find this generation the most stimulating, exciting, provocative, yes, promising era I've ever seen or read about. I am not yet ready to die. I can't wait to see what is going to happen next." Like the French editor carried in a cart through the streets of Paris to the guillotine, I too say, It's too bad to cut my head off. I want to see how all this is going to turn out. Germinative ideas are abroad. There are open doors of possibility for good as well as evil, which did not exist when I was born. And though I'm an old man, I share at least a little the hopeful spirit of the young who face life with the rays of morning on their white shields of expectation. So what is the battle we have to fight? Keep our wits about us, reach out to help and lift, and keep our confidence in God. I do not pray you take them out of the world, but to keep them from evil. As you sent me into the world, so I send them. So let's go. After we sing the first and last verse of the hymn.